This story took place in the summer of the previous year, which was 2022. I'm Lori, and I embarked on a romantic getaway with my boyfriend, Andrew. We had meticulously planned this vacation for several months, and our excitement was palpable. Our choice was to reserve an Airbnb in a secluded cabin deep within the woods of upstate New York, where online photos had promised seclusion, tranquility, and breathtaking vistas. As we ventured further from civilization, the well-paved roads transformed into narrow dirt paths. Our GPS signal faded, leaving us surrounded by towering trees. A sense of unease began to creep over me, but Andrew reassured me that this was all part of the adventure. Eventually, we arrived at the cabin, a charming wooden structure that resembled something from a postcard. The isolation was almost tangible, with no other houses in sight. Our excitement returned, and we couldn't wait to settle in. The cabin's interior exuded coziness, featuring rustic wooden furniture and an inviting fireplace begging to be lit. Our first night was spent cuddled up by the fire, sipping wine and relishing the solitude. It seemed perfect, at least initially. The following morning, Andrew decided to explore the nearby woods while I opted to stay behind and read. After about 30 minutes, concern started to creep in. He should have returned by now. Anxiety gnawed at me, akin to a persistent itch. Attempts to call him were futile, as there was no cell reception in our remote location. As the sun dipped below the trees, I heard distant rustling of leaves, and a wave of relief washed over me as Andrew returned. He reported seeing nothing extraordinary, and commented on how the forest seemed like the ideal setting for our planned romantic getaway. Later that night, we meticulously secured all the doors and windows before going to bed. However, as we settled in, I heard something that made my heart drop. Faint, whispering voices echoing through the woods, unintelligible yet undeniably eerie. I woke Andrew, and both of us strained to listen. The voices grew louder, and it became evident that they were drawing closer to the cabin. Panic set in as we realized there was no rational explanation. We were miles from any neighbors, and we hadn't encountered a single soul since our arrival. Suddenly, the crackling sound of an old radio playing a classic song, likely from the 1940s, pierced the darkness. Its voice cut through the night like a jagged knife. Andrew, being brave and curious, ventured out of bed and approached the living room window to investigate. I followed closely behind, my heart pounding in my chest. As we reached the living room, we spotted the radio on a small wooden table outside. Its dial was now tuned to a frequency emitting only static. The music had vanished. Andrew unlocked the door and went to turn it off. I watched every step from the window, my blood running cold. Figures stood not far from him, perhaps about 70 feet away, dark and indistinct. They observed Andrew with an eerie intensity that gave me the creeps. Without thinking, I shouted, "Run!" Andrew snapped out of his daze and sprinted back toward the living room, slamming the door shut and locking it. We went to bed, assuming it was some sort of prank. Hours passed, and then it happened. A cacophony of bizarre sounds erupted from outside, pounding against the door, knocking at the windows, and eerie scratching noises reverberated through the cabin. We clung to each other in terror, clutching kitchen knives as if they were our only defense. The sounds persisted relentlessly, but we couldn't discern the source. The hours dragged on, and as the first light of dawn broke, the sounds gradually faded away. When morning arrived, we hastily departed. We contacted the Airbnb host, who was extremely sympathetic, offering a refund and apologies. For those wondering, we refrained from calling the police due to the absence of a cell signal and our true isolation in the woods. Needless to say, we didn't sleep a wink that night. For weeks, I had eagerly anticipated my upcoming business trip to Arizona, enticed by the enchanting desert landscape. The anticipation had driven me to find what appeared to be the ideal Airbnb for my stay, a delightful, secluded desert dwelling, perfect for a peaceful work excursion. After an extensive drive, I finally reached the Airbnb. The host had sent a message indicating that the keys were under the doormat for easy access. I retrieved the keys and entered the house, which seemed quite ordinary, complete with cozy furnishings and all the amenities I required. As night fell, I settled in and decided to unwind by watching a football game on my laptop. The soothing desert sounds outside and the game on the screen combined to create an idyllic atmosphere. However, then came a faint tapping at the window. Initially, I brushed it off, assuming it was just a desert insect colliding with the glass. Yet, the tapping persisted, growing louder and more insistent. My heart raced as I paused the game and peered out the window. To my horror, I spotted a figure lurking in the shadows, concealed among the distant bushes. Instinctively, I closed the curtains and hurriedly checked all the doors to ensure they were securely locked. My mind raced with thoughts of intruders or trespassers, but the nearest neighbor was miles away, and I found myself truly alone in the desert. In a panic, I debated whether to call the host and describe the menacing figure outside the house, inquiring whether he had any idea who it might be. However, before I could dial his number, the power suddenly went out, enveloping the house in darkness. I called the host, inquiring whether he had any idea who the person might be. The host, sounding concerned, urged me to stay calm, attributing the noise to a coyote that could be lurking around. He also explained the procedure for restoring power in case of an outage, instructing me to go to the electrical panel outside to reset the main circuit breaker. With trepidation, I ventured into the desert night, armed with the feeble light of my phone. I located the electrical panel but hesitated briefly, fearing that the earlier figure might still be lurking. Nevertheless, I couldn't remain in the darkness, so I summoned my courage and flipped the breaker. Just as I was about to head back to the house, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps from the darkness. Someone was sprinting toward me in the desert night. I could barely discern their silhouette. In a panic, I sprinted back to the house, my heart pounding. The footsteps behind me grew louder, accompanied by heavy breathing. The desert night seemed to close in around me as I fumbled with the keys, eventually unlocking the door and rushing inside. I locked the door and barricaded it as best I could with furniture. My mind raced, attempting to make sense of the events. Who was chasing me in the dark? Exhausted and still on edge, I decided to resume watching the game in an attempt to distract myself from the unsettling occurrences. However, a chilling realization washed over me as I replayed the conversation in my mind. The host had directed me to the electrical panel, but how did he know about the power outage before I even mentioned it? It couldn't have been a mere coincidence. 10 minutes later, a window shattered, prompting me to flee to my car as swiftly as possible. I locked the car doors first, leaving my belongings behind. Through the rearview mirror, I looked back at the bedroom window, and to my horror, I saw him, the host, inside the very bedroom I had just vacated. As I sped away from the Airbnb, panic coursing through my veins, I knew I had to call for help. I reached for my phone and dialed 911, providing them with my location and the terrifying situation I had just experienced. Within minutes, the police arrived at the scene. They approached the Airbnb cautiously, guns drawn, ready for any potential threat. As they entered the house, they found the shattered window and the disarray inside. After a thorough search of the premises, the police discovered the host still inside the bedroom, where he had been lurking. They promptly arrested him, putting him in handcuffs and reading him his rights. The tension in the air was palpable as the officers questioned him about his actions and intentions. It turned out that the host had a criminal history and had been using his Airbnb as a base for various illegal activities. He had set up the whole scenario to lure unsuspecting guests into dangerous situations, intending to rob them or worse. As the police investigated further, they found evidence linking the host to several other criminal incidents in the area. He was subsequently charged with multiple crimes, including burglary, assault, and attempted robbery. I had been using Airbnb to rent out my spare room for some time, consistently enjoying positive experiences. Previous guests had come and gone, leaving behind favorable reviews and occasional tokens of appreciation. However, everything took a drastic turn when I received a booking request from an individual named John. John's profile picture was somewhat blurry, but his initial message appeared polite. He explained that he was in town for a business conference and needed accommodation for 2 nights. Given the last-minute nature of the booking and my eagerness to earn some extra income, I accepted without much hesitation. On the evening when John was expected to arrive, I took the time to tidy up the guest room and provide fresh towels. He had mentioned a 9 p.m. arrival time, so I patiently waited, glancing out the window for any sign of his arrival. The clock ticked past 9, then 10, and eventually at 11 p.m., I heard a car pull into the driveway. A sense of relief washed over me as I thought, finally, he's here. With a smile, I opened the door to welcome John, but my expression quickly faded upon seeing him. He was a tall, slender man whose crooked smile failed to reach his cold eyes. Carrying a small duffel bag, he offered only a curt nod when I asked, "You're John, right?" I tried to maintain a friendly tone. "Yes, that's me," he replied, brushing past me without further conversation. I escorted him to the guest room, where he dropped his bag without a word. "I just need a quiet place to rest," he tersely stated. I proceeded to give him a brief house tour, pointing out the bathroom and kitchen, but he displayed minimal interest. Without expressing gratitude, he retreated to his room. An unsettling feeling nagged at me, but I attributed it to exhaustion and attempted to get some sleep. Lying in bed that night, an increasing unease settled upon me. I repeatedly heard strange noises emanating from John's room, muffled voices, shuffling sounds, and the occasional thud. It seemed as though he was conversing with someone, despite no mention of additional guests or friends accompanying him. The following morning, I decided to address the peculiar sounds. Knocking on John's door yielded no response. Knocking louder, I finally witnessed the door slowly creak open, revealing only his disheveled face. John stood there with bloodshot eyes. "Is everything all right?" I inquired, feigning concern. He muttered something unintelligible and promptly shut the door. Bewildered, I felt compelled to understand the situation better, so I pressed my ear against the door. I was utterly terrified by what I heard next. John was speaking in hushed tones, as if engaged in a ritual or something of that nature. His voice conveyed desperation, and his words were a garbled mixture of pleas. My heart raced as I strained to discern his words. I cannot recall the exact content of his speech, but it seemed as though he might have been under the influence of hallucinogenic substances. I knew I had to contact the police, but I also feared how John might react if he discovered my intentions. Slowly backing away from his door, I retrieved my phone and discreetly dialed 911. Upon the police's arrival, they entered John's room and arrested him. What I observed there left me deeply disturbed. Unsettling drawings, seemingly composed of blood, and a satanic symbol on the floor in front of the bed. According to the police, John would no longer pose a threat to me.